hobbyists, Dustin here with Jagged Brush Studios with the next installment in the Fifth Trooper Network's hobby series. Hopefully you've had a chance to check out the video where I show you the tools that I recommend that you get so that you can get started in the hobby, and then the basing video where I show you some very simple basing techniques that you can use to make your miniatures pop. Today we're going to cover one of those techniques that I covered in the basing video. I've gotten a lot of questions about this one. I've had a lot of requests from people to help show them what to do here, how to do the technique, and just exactly how to make it work. It's a really simple technique, but we're going to get into how to use these 3 brushes to dry brush your miniatures. So what exactly does the term dry brushing mean? That's what I get asked a lot, and so let's talk a little bit about that. Dry brushing is exactly that. We're going to get our brush wet with some paint, we're going to brush all of the paint off of there, and then we're going to use that dry, quote, dry brush to put some paint on our miniature. Dry is kind of a misnomer here. It's not completely dry, but it's nearly, and it's enough that it looks dry. So that's what dry brushing is exactly. Dry brushing is best used when you have a miniature with a lot of little fine details that you don't want to spend time painstakingly picking each one out with a fine tip of a brush. So we use dry brushing in order to pick those details out and get a really great looking tabletop ready army without putting in the hours of work that you would have to for a display miniature. First, let's talk about the tools that we're going to need. These 3 brushes I talked about earlier. The first one that I have is not a paintbrush at all. It's actually an eyeshadow brush. Get this in the makeup aisle of your local market. I think I paid a couple bucks for this. Cool thing is when I'm done with it, toss it away, get a new one. I do clean it out when I'm not using it, but if it gets all gunked up, I'm not worried about it. In fact, that helps these bristles, which are really fine in detail, and there's a ton of them, but they're really soft. If there's any paint way up in there, it helps them splay out a little bit more, and that's actually not too bad for dry brushing. So this one's round. It works great for large areas. These next 2 are both flat brushes. They're essentially the same brush. They have a little bit different cut in the bristles, but they serve the same purpose. You don't have to have any one of these specifically, but I do recommend if you're just going to get one, get you some flat ones. I love that makeup brush. I use it very frequently, but these ones are actually going to be more versatile. Get a couple different sizes if you can. Where do you get them? Don't buy yourself new brushes. If you do, get the cheapest ones that you can find. I bought these for a couple bucks at the craft store. I bought them, brought them home, crammed those bristles up. You really want them to be good and worn out. They're pretty gnarly at this point. I'm not going to put paint onto my miniature with this unless it's dry brushing. These are perfect for that. This one's flat. This one has an angled tip so that you can get in different areas with it. Tear them up. If you've got some old brushes sitting in your paintbrush cup, pull those puppies out and get to working on them and get those bristles splayed out so that they're ready to be a dry brush. Next, we need our paint. If you've heard me say thin your paints, thin your paints, thin your paints, don't. Not for this. You want some thick paint for that. We're going to work with it straight from your bottle, your pot, or whatever you happen to use. You do not want thin paint for this. You want the paint to have a really thick consistency so that when we put it on our brush and we try to brush it off, that we get most of the paint off, but some of it stays on the bristles because it's so thick. So, thick paint and a dry brush, as the name says. You don't want any water in your brush at all, so you should make sure it's as dry as possible. The last thing you're going to see is that I don't use my wet palette in this. It's my favorite tool in my toolbox. Really, I'm not making that up. Even more than my brushes, I love my wet palette. However, a wet palette is the wrong tool for dry brushing. Wet, dry, it's in the name of each of them. They don't go together. So a wet palette's going to thin your paints out and cause your paint to not be the consistency that you need it to be. So set that wet palette aside, get yourself a dry palette. You'll see that I use a paper towel in the video here. It's the same paper towel that I use to brush the brush off on when I'm ready to dry brush. That's pretty handy for me, but you could use whatever plastic palette that you have, or your hand, I guess, if you wanted to, a piece of cardboard, anything like that, as long as it's not got any kind of moisture on it. So, brushes, paint, palette, I think we're ready to go. Let's get down to the paint station and show you how to do it. Step 1, prime your minis. Step 2, get yourself a nice clean paper towel. Once you've got your paper towel, we're going to apply some of the gunmetal paint to it. Then we're going to grab our dry brush and we'll dip it into the gunmetal paint. Get quite a bit on there, as you really kind of want to coat the bristles quite a bit. So get quite a bit and then push it down into the paper towel as you brush in circles. You're going to want to brush most of this paint off so that when you touch it to a clean white part, you don't have to drop the brush. But when you touch it to a clean white part, it will be mostly non-existent once you brush it on there. So like a very faint gray. And then you're going to apply paint as you pull in a downstroke. So only on the downstroke, not in both directions. So So see, as I pull towards my body, I'm making big looping areas and hitting the ridges. Dry brushing is great for picking out details that are raised. Another great thing that dry brushing is good for is applying highlights. So here I squeeze out a little bit of a lighter silver. I'm going to get some on my brush in the same method that I did for the darker gunmetal, and then I'm going to pick out just a few ridges to really make them kind of pop a little bit. Alright, I'm going to speed it up just a little bit. Techniques are all the same, but you can apply any color through dry brushing. Metallics are especially good at it, but any color is great. So I'm going to apply a heavier blue here, and then I will leave it heavier because I want to come back and pick some of the higher ridges out with some of the silver to give the effect that it's maybe, I don't know, worn off a little bit. Here I'm going to go back with some of that gunmetal. Don't get too hung up on the colors I'm using here. I'm just demonstrating the technique to y'all. I had an extra vase laying around and figured it would be great for this video, so I just kind of went with a whim and picked out colors as I went. But here I'm picking out some of those details to make it look scratched. Sometimes you need to dry brush on a lighter color in order to apply a color before you do it. So here I'm dry brushing on some white primer over the black to give me a nice light base to apply the light blue-green that I'm going to put on next. Light blue-green going on now, and sometimes you have to dry brush on multiple coats if you're trying to get great coverage, because dry brushing isn't really good at coverage. So here I probably do 2 or 3 coats of this blue-gray or blue-green before I'm done with it. Alright, free technique, stippling. Much like dry brush, it's a really good technique to have. Get some on your brush, dab it off on the paper towel, and then dab the miniature or the base. No pulling, no streaking, just push straight in, straight out, otherwise you get brush marks and you don't want that. Use orange, browns, they're good for that. And then finally, dry brushing leaves a nice chalky texture afterwards that is very evident that you dry brushed. So sometimes it's really helpful to tie it all together with a wash. So take a really crummy brush, and I just, especially because these are bases, I'm applying the wash on really heavy as it's not going to matter in the end. So apply it on the real heavy, let it dry, and voila, you're done. I hope this video was helpful for you. I know that dry brushing was a technique that was a little bit overwhelming to me when I first got started, but once I figured it out, it's real easy. So let me know if you have any thoughts or questions in the comments. And if not, thanks for hanging out with me. This is Dustin with Jagged Brush Studios for the 5th Trooper Network saying thanks, and get out there and paint some more.